Yes. Hi. So again, I'm sorry that I'm not there in the flesh, but in the robot form. But I'll be talking about communication applications today. I'm talking about the questions we can ask and the results that we can get if we look at them from the perspective of an ecosystem, and what the costs are for the users if we don't take this into account. This is work I did with Carla Griggio and Wendy Mackay from the SIGCHI group in Paris, who will be on standby in case something goes wrong and they can jump in. So we used to have just a very few distinct types of communications, like phones and email and text messaging. And often when we discuss how a communication medium affects our users' communication pattern and experiences, research points to things inherent in the app, like its functionality or its cost. So like the fact that people chit-chat more if they have a messaging history, or that the shortness of text messaging makes people have more blunt conversations. But in the past 5 to 10 years, this landscape of computer-mediated communication has exploded, where now we have literally hundreds of different communication apps. So just an example here, these are some, not even all of the mobile instant messaging apps that I have on my phone. And what's interesting in this new landscape is that all of these channels are pretty much the same. So they're kind of interchangeable, but people still use them in very idiosyncratic ways, which suggests that there's more that's affecting the message than just the inherent qualities of the medium. So if we want to figure out what unique qualities these apps have beyond what's inherent in them and how it affects the communication, our unit of analysis needs to be more than the single app, but instead the user's ecosystem of apps. And by looking at how these apps then relate to each other, we can begin to understand why and how users manage their communication among them, how they distribute their contacts, and finally then how the use of one app is affected by the particular other apps in the user's ecosystem. And previous research has addressed some elements of these questions. So, for example, some have discussed how users take advantage of having multiple channels in order to kind of blend them together for a single conversation, because it lets the users access different functionalities. But this blending was only in the context of one person communicating with one other person rather than one-to-many. Then we have some other research on mostly social networking sites, which has looked at how users carefully manage their communication with multiple contexts across or in one channel, because mixing them actually creates tension. So this is mostly because the communication is through that single channel and the individual interactions are public and visible to the end. But the picture that we're interested in here is one user.
The computer went to sleep.
All good.
We're good?
Yeah.
Good.
OK. So again, the picture that we're interested in is this one. One user communicating with multiple people using multiple channels or multiple communication applications. And some of the question that this picture raises in this new landscape specifically is why do people use these very similar communication applications side by side? What advantages do you get by doing this? How do users decide which context to put where? And how do you maintain these distributions? And by answering these kind of questions, we can get a picture of how a communication application is used relative to the other apps in an ecosystem, and what the qualities are that separate them from each other. So to address these questions, we interviewed 18 people using a variation of a critical incident technique, which means that we asked very specific, recent, and memorable stories for them to describe these about things like, who do you communicate with through which app? How is this app different from the other one? So we had questions like, what was the last time you blocked somebody? Right? Very specific questions. And what we found was that participants care about distributing their contacts across apps, because if they're in the same one, they contaminate each other. So a shared communication space, which in this case is the app, then is not just a collection of isolated individual conversations, but rather the relationship between the user and a contact becomes intertwined with everyone else that's also there. So for example, and this is a reconstruction of a story, we saw participants swinging between emotion moods. So here you're talking to your mother, which is nice and fine, and then all of a sudden you see an X pop up with a rather angry message. So just this presence of the other contact there allows these relationships to kind of mingle together. So other things I did was copy jokes across conversations or writing styles, or it even affected the overall pattern of use of the app. For example, we had one participant whose uncle started traveling the world, and so she started spending a lot more time on Skype. And as a result, she also started kind of to rekindle her friendship with other contacts that were on Skype. And one of those friendships then eventually turned into a relationship. And she said, I'm pretty sure that if my uncle had never traveled the world, this wouldn't have happened, right? So these contacts sharing the same app become tied up with each other. And we saw that participants tried to control this intertwining by distributing the context among the different apps that they have, and that they have a couple of different strategies to kind of create and maintain these distributions. The first one being this one, where they try to prevent a contact from entering. So what you see here is somebody asking, hey, do you have WhatsApp? And then you answer, oh, no, sorry, I really don't use it. While actually, in fact, they're lying, because clearly they're using it with their mom, right? So they'd do this, or they would say, oh, I don't use it that often. Or they would tell their friends, don't give out my phone number, or don't give out my username, just to try and prevent people from entering an app. When someone still managed to enter an app, they try to move or remove that intruder. And here we see somebody who is kind of implicitly moving a contact by replying to a message through a different app. So a message from WhatsApp replying through Snapchat. Or they would do it by, for example, only replying much faster in one channel. Or explicitly by just telling them, hey, let's talk through this one. Now, when both of these strategies failed, participants had very interesting ways of appropriating the technology to shape how a contact was present in the app. So here we see a participant that wouldn't save contacts so that they would always pop up as a number. She would have a whole conversation with them. But she said this is a way for her to reserve WhatsApp just for the important people. We had another participant who, for example, would continuously archive conversations, so only the most important contacts would be at the top. And what's interesting is that the participant acknowledged that this didn't actually affect the contact's ability to communicate with them, but it was just a way of managing the experience of their presence. So people actively create and shape personalized communication environments by managing their contacts within and across their apps, right? So we introduced the notion of a communication place to refer to these communication apps on top of which users construct personal and idiosyncratic identities. And these can be defined according to three things. Their membership rules, so who belongs there, who doesn't, who's supposed to not be there. Their perceived purpose, what they're for, or their emotional connotation, kind of how it feels to the user. So some participants, like in the title of this paper, say WhatsApp is their communication place for family and Facebook messages for friends. Or they would say, oh, texting is for logistical things, right? That's its purpose. Or they would say, oh, Slack, that's intimate, and Skype is kind of cold. And these communication places are unique to the user rather than inherent quality, because we see that participants describe them in contradicting ways. So for some would say texting, that's intimate, and other people would say, oh, no, it's impersonal, right? So they're very idiosyncratic constructs. And there's a reciprocal relationship between, on the one hand, the communication place, and on the other hand, the underlying app. Because based on the communication place constructed on top of it, the same actions or experiences were evaluated differently by the user. So one participant said, oh, I deleted this contact on Tinder, but not on WhatsApp because that would be more personal. Or another person would say, oh, there's this really good friend of mine and we're really close, but we're not close enough for WhatsApp, right? So moving across communication places was seen as a step in a relationship. Now, while these communication places are relatively stable, they're still kind of continuously redefined in response to things like new features or a changed phone number or an app becoming more popular, which meant that participants were constantly trying to negotiate between the communication place they wanted and the environment that was imposed on them, either by the behavior of the contacts or because of the design of communication applications. And the difference between on the one hand, the human relationships, and the other, the design of the apps, meant that participants had to go through all kinds of really strange and painful contortions to manage their communication places. And the consequences were actually surprisingly severe at times. So we categorized these consequences in kind of three dichotomies. So the first one being relationships are quite nuanced, whereas the apps are quite crude, meaning that the functionality that an app offers to manage the presence of a contact is too binary compared to the nuance in the user's relationship. So one participant here was saying, oh, I regretted adding this person here, but I'm not sure what to do, whether I should block him because he's very nice, but I just don't want to see him. So in the end, she kind of just dealt with it and left him there. So we found a lot of participants who kind of struggled between, on the one hand, wanting to live up to their own values of being a good person and communicating in the right way, but also managing which relationships were allowed to become intertwined. And in some cases, it meant that they actually allowed somebody to persist, like in this example, even though it was damaging their relationship with other people because they started avoiding the app, or it damaged their own psychological well-being because they would feel a lot of stress every time a notification would come in from that particular app, even though it might be from somebody else. The second one is that relationships are fluid, but apps are quite inflexible. Relationships are dynamic and they kind of develop over time, but the boundaries between the apps are fixed, right? So a contact might be in the right communication place at one point, but as the relationship develops, it might become out of place. So we had one participant who had Facebook or WhatsApp as kind of her place for close friends and family, but then one of her family members passed away, and she would kind of be confronted with a loss every time she opened the app, and she would say, well, I don't want to delete them because this is somebody who just died and I care a lot about them, but I also can't be seeing this every day. And she didn't want to delete the messages because they become very precious to her. So in the end, what she did, which is kind of poetic, is she wrote down all of the very meaningful messages by hand in a little notebook, and then deleted the history. And then the last one being that relationships are unique, but the features are quite generic in apps. So participants have problem with the fact that the features in an app can't be selectively applied to a contact based on the needs of a particular relationship. So when they needed to access or escape a certain functionality, that meant that they had to move a contact out of place. So we had one participant who was using a dating app, and he gave his number to a guy so he could keep chatting with him even though he wasn't on Wi-Fi. But it also meant that those messages were visible on the lock screen. So this guy texted the participant saying, hey, do you want to come over? And his friend saw it, and the message was a little bit more explicit than what you see here. But this breached the privacy of the participant, which is something that's especially sensitive for sexual minorities. So to address these types of breakdowns, we suggest 3 design directions that would kind of make the connection between the app and the communication place more flexible and to give more control over the communication place to the user. The first being that we want to allow users to create multiple instances of the same app so they can build multiple communication places on top of it, but still have each of them have their own icon and notifications. And this would address problems associated with the intertwining of relationships without forcing people to switch apps. Second, we want to allow users to decouple conversations and histories from the application so they can easily move these conversations across apps independent of their communication partner. So right now, this is kind of the image that we have of these communication apps where there's a forced symmetry between sender and receiver. We both have to agree which app we're going to use. But instead, we want something like this where we can independently choose where to send and receive the messages from the contact. Right? So this would be similar to the way that email works these days. And it's already sort of done in, for example, Facebook Messenger, where you can receive text messages next to your data messages, but it just forwards all of your text messages to that particular app. You can't manage it per contact. And we actually didn't see any of our participants use this. And lastly, we suggest that communication apps should allow their functionality to be accessed through other apps. So this is already done with, for example, the camera app, right? So any communication app can access the camera app to take pictures. But we suggest that it can be expanded to include things like stickers or more substantial things like voice calling or read receipts, right? And this would allow users to access or escape functionality without having to move the contact to another communication place and possibly then contaminating that one. So to summarize, contexts contaminate the app in that the user's relationships and communication patterns with a contact are affected by the other contacts in that app. Then users try and control their contact's impact using these strategies to kind of distribute them across the communication apps or manage how they're present in the app. And then apps develop particular identities based on these efforts that users do to control the contacts. And these identities are called communication places, which have membership rules, perceived purposes, and emotional connotations. So by going beyond a single app as the unit of analysis, we're able to explore kind of how the use of one app is shaped by the other apps in the user's ecosystem. But they don't just have ecosystems of apps, they also have ecosystems of communication places. And the identity of one is again shaped by the identity of the others and vice versa. So if we don't design communication apps with their position in the ecosystem in mind, which we can discover using their communication place, the consequences for the user can be quite severe, as we showed some examples. So if there's anybody in the room who is involved with the design of these apps, please kind of remember to consider life beyond the single application. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for navigating the remote situation. We have time for some questions, and it's going to be especially important to come up to the mic so that Midas can hear you. And I'm going to take advantage of being at the mic. I know you can't really see me. But so your plea to look beyond individual applications is complicated by the fact that, in fact, companies want to wall off their features and their user communities and kind of hold on to So how would we deal with that? Not speaking totally hypothetically, not that I represent one of those companies, and not that you called Skype cold either.
Right.
But
Somebody else.
how would you
Quoting.
deal with that?
Well, so this is an interesting question because it also kind of ties into what we think the role of research is in this, right? So obviously, these companies have a business model, and right now that relies on a quantity of contacts because that is what they're getting money from. But as you can see with the consequences of not designing an open application, they can be quite severe, right? So do we as researchers then have the role to look at business models of all the suggestions that we make? Or should we instead say, okay, well, these are the consequences that we see, and we understand that you have your interests, but our interests as researchers are slightly different. Now, the other thing, because I totally agree that we also need to kind of operate in the real world, right? So one thing that with the implications that we suggest that we've also done is we could have gone way more extreme and had kind of suggested a very radically different ecosystem environment. But instead, we kind of try to be in the middle where our suggestions aren't very simple, but they're still different enough that, for example, using multiple instances of the same app would fit into the way that these applications are designed now and fit with the business model, but still allow some of the users to do what they want to do. So we're trying to be kind of bridging the gap between, but I mean, I understand totally there are different priorities that there's kind of a tension between.
Great. Time for other questions? Going up to the mic. I'll ask another one while people are thinking. So you describe people choosing apps based on the other people that they want to communicate with them, but isn't that also, different apps have different features, and so did anyone ever mention the case that, they really wish they'd have this feature, but they were in another app, or what role did features play in selecting which communication apps to use with circles of friends? Right.
So it's interesting because on the one hand, the motivation from this kind of came from the fact that there are now so many of these functionally very similar applications. But we did find some situations where people said, okay, with this particular contact, I need this sticker that I created somewhere else because I know that this contact loves this particular type of dog, and I have a sticker in that app that is of that dog. So it's not necessarily functionality that is independent of the user that they're trying